Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Linda Medvin, the director of the Arthur and Emily Gutterman Family Center for Holocaust and Human Rights Education at Florida Atlantic University. Welcome to tonight's program, The Nazi Olympics. I have a special FAU welcome to Avram Fogelman tonight. The Avram B. Fogelman Sports Museum is now open for in-person visits on FAU's Boca Raton campus. The collection, that includes the Olympic torch used at the 1936 Olympics, is considered to be one of the largest private sports libraries amassed by one person. Information about the Sports Museum, including its hours and the days that it's open, will be posted in the chat. Thank you for joining us today. We are very excited to welcome more than 300 educators and members of the community from Broward and Palm Beach, as well as from the rest of Florida and from all over the country. Florida legislation mandates required instruction of the Holocaust, as well as African and African American history. We think our topic is appropriate, timely, and extremely relevant in today's world. The rescheduled 2020 Summer Olympic Games in Tokyo are coming up in July, and I think we will see different concerns and controversy as we get closer to that worldwide event. Our center works very closely with the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, and we are honored to have as our guest presenters tonight Christina Kuchava-Varia, the program coordinator for the William Levine Family Institute for Holocaust Education, and Sally Levine, the executive director of the Georgia Commission on the Holocaust and the Museum Teacher Fellow for the Holocaust Museum. And of course, many thanks go to Cody, who's our guru, tech guru, and handholder, especially me. The handouts were posted. They're on the Google Drive. We sent them out through email. Please have them handy because the presenters will be referring to them this afternoon. The chat has been disabled. If you have any questions or comments, put them in the Q&A and we will answer them at the end of the program. At this time, I would like to welcome for session one, Sally Levine, with an overview of Jim Crow and anti-Semitism.
Thank you, Linda, and welcome to everybody. Thank you for your time this afternoon and for joining our program in honor of Black History Month. Today's program is Black Americans in the Nazi Olympics. And today we're going to begin by exploring the history and impact of Nazi racial anti-Semitism and Jim Crow. Although different in many ways, anti-Semitism in Nazi Germany during the 1930s and anti-Black racism in America during the Jim Crow era had a significant impact on their respective populations. We all know that different experiences occur with each individual, and that understanding context is critical to exploring and analyzing anti-Semitism and racism. We also know that good teaching requires us to avoid comparisons of suffering, but exploring these histories together during this same time period can help us to consider the issues of anti-Semitism and racism then and today. So we're going to use the museum's online lesson, Black Americans in the Nazi Olympics, and we're going to try to address three essential questions over the course of this afternoon. First, what was Jim Crow? Second, how did life in Jim Crow America inform the debates about whether athletes should participate in the 1936 Olympics? And finally, did Olympic achievement of Black American athletes in the Nazi Olympics translate into better lives for them in the United States? So racists believe that human potential and behavior are determined by genetic characteristics, which are unchangeable or immutable. Eugenics was a movement in the early 20th century. It literally means good birth. In 1883, Francis Galton in England used the term eugenics to refer to selective breeding of stronger, desirable races, selective breeding of people, to create a stock of better men and women. Eugenics was popular in many parts of the world, including the United States. We know today that this is bogus science, that race is only a cultural classification of groups. After Germany's defeat in World War I and the weakening of its government, the Weimar Republic, eugenics began to influence government policy and spending. Those who supported eugenics theory believed that if unfit people were permitted to reproduce, the race would be weakened. Resources which could be used to improve the healthy and strong would have to be spent on the weak and the unfit. There was also concern that those who they considered fit were having smaller families. Supporters of eugenics saw this as destroying the quality of Germany's population. They proposed tax credits to support large, healthy families and also forced sterilization of what they considered the genetically unfit. Under Nazi policy, scientists and doctors participated in carrying out these policies. Nazi theories in eugenics and race considered Germans and other Europeans as superior in both body and mind. Nazi race laws and policies deprived Jews, Black people, and Roma, or Gypsies, of their rights. Nazi theory viewed Jews as a race, not a religion, and racial anti-Semitism is the prejudice against or hatred of Jews based on these false scientific theories. This aspect of racism was always an integral part of Nazism.
The Nazi regime aimed to create a racially pure Germany, whose so-called superior traits would make it ideally suited to rule the entire European continent. Nazism taught that racial struggle was the driving force in history. Superior races must battle inferior races or be corrupted by them. The Nazi concept of a national community was exclusive and based on race, as defined in the new laws and decrees. Heinrich Himmler and the SS led the ideological battle. Racist ideas were taught in schools. Some groups, such as Jews, Slavs, Blacks, and Roma, also called Gypsies, were labeled racially inferior. People with mental or physical disabilities were designated unworthy of life. Scientists and medical professionals applied pseudo-scientific theories for measuring and valuing racial characteristics.
We all know that Nazi racism resulted in the murder of millions who were considered racially unfit. Nazi racial policy ultimately led to the genocide of the Jews in Europe. Another resource that we can use as teachers, listed in the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum lesson plan, is from the Ferris State University Jim Crow Museum of Racist Memorabilia. This website provides a helpful overview of Jim Crow. So let's look at the background of Jim Crow. Throughout the 1930s and 40s, a white entertainer, Thomas Dartmouth Rice, performed a popular song and dance act, speaking and behaving as what he described as a slave. He named his fictional character Jim Crow. Rice darkened his face, acted like a clown, and imitated in a demeaning way the speech of African Americans. During his performances as Jim Crow, he sang what he called Negro songs or ditties, one of which was the song Jump Jim Crow. Rice was a popular performer in blackface, and he had many successful tours both in the United States and England. The character of Jim Crow became a popular act for white comedians who in blackface performed demeaning portrayals of African Americans. After the American Civil War, many states had passed laws that denied Black people basic civil and human rights. The name of the fictional character, Jim Crow, became the term used to describe the laws, customs, and rules from the 1870s all the way to the 1960s, rules that belittled and separated African Americans. The Jim Crow laws were reflected in everyday life, in objects, and even on images of products in the supermarket, which have only recently become removed. Also on the Jim Crow Museum website is a list of Jim Crow laws in the United States, and here we can see a wide range of public activities made up the lists. Some of these laws included, for example, nurses. No person or corporation shall require any white female nurse to nurse in wards or rooms in hospitals, either public or private, in which Negro men are placed. Burial. The officer in charge shall not bury or allowed to be buried any colored persons upon ground set apart or used for the burial of white persons. And we all know from the news just last month, a Black sheriff's deputy was denied burial in a white cemetery in Louisiana. This was in January 2021. The owners of the cemetery have since apologized and have removed the whites only provision, but vestiges of Jim Crow still remain. Textbooks. Books shall not be interchangeable between white and colored schools, but shall continue to be used by the race first using them. 90 years ago, on August 7th, 1930, a white mob used tear gas, crowbars, and hammers to break into the Grant County Jail in Marion, Indiana. They attempted to capture and lynch 3 young Black men who had been accused of murdering a white man and assaulting a white woman. Thomas Shipp and Abram Smith, both 19 years old, were severely beaten and lynched, and 16-year-old James Cameron was badly beaten but survived. The bodies of Mr. Shipp and Smith were hung from trees in the courthouse yard. They hung there for hours as thousands of white men, women, and children arrived at the scene. Public spectacle lynchings were not uncommon during this time, and when the sheriff finally cut the ropes from the corpses, members of the crowd rushed in to take parts of the men's bodies as souvenirs. Photographs like this were shared with friends and family of the white crowd. No one was held to account for this crime, as local authorities claimed that no one could be identified. Mounting outside pressure eventually led to a trial of 2 accused members of the mob. Each of them was found not guilty by juries of all white men. Years later, the alleged assault victim testified that she had not in fact been raped. The Nazi Olympics took place in 1936. So how can we set the stage for our students to help them understand what the world looked like at that time? What events, issues, and concerns before 1936 played a role in how Americans responded? Another helpful resource is the museum's exhibition, Americans in the Holocaust. This exhibition examines the motives, pressures, and fears that shaped Americans' responses to Nazism, war, and genocide. And it addresses the following questions. What did the US government and American people know about the threats posed by Nazi Germany? Americans in the Holocaust provides additional historical context about America in 1933. On his first day as president, FDR told Americans, "The only thing we have to fear is fear itself." In 1933, the 4th year of the Depression, 25% of US workers were unemployed. At that time, public facilities, churches, and schools were racially segregated. And at that time, the US continued to limit immigration, especially by people of what they called undesirable national origin, including Eastern European Jews. So let's look at a brief film clip from the exhibition, which provides an overview of life in the United States in 1933. Most of this is silent.
Let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself.
Okay, so the Americans in the Holocaust Exhibition also provides articles from newspapers across the country. The headlines reveal the information to which Americans had access as they read their morning papers or settled down to read after the activities of the day. These headlines announce events in the early days of 1933 that reveal how the Nazis began consolidating their power and defining their enemies. Another great resource is from the National Archives' Docs Teach. And again, we can create context by looking at documents, primary sources from the period. Docs Teach provides images of the primary sources and activities and worksheets to assist our students in interpretation. So in 1931, the Scottsboro boys, 9 Black teenagers, were falsely accused of raping 2 white women aboard a train near Scottsboro, Alabama. The trials and repeated retrials of the boys sparked an international uproar and produced 2 landmark US Supreme Court verdicts. These young men spent years battling the courts while they were incarcerated in the harsh conditions of the Alabama prison system. This resource that you see on the left from Docs Teach is a letter that was written on Mother's Day in 1933. 5 of the Scottsboro boys' mothers wrote a letter to President Franklin Roosevelt, imploring him to free their sons. Another powerful way to create historical context for your students is the museum's timeline activity. This lesson can be used in many ways. In addition to the museum's timeline cards of historical events, laws and decrees, and individual profiles, you can add events as their teacher in American history, American immigration law, and Holocaust literature. There are many creative ways you can use this lesson and resource. Let's now look at some of the events, laws, and decrees prior to the Nazi Olympics, which can help your students to understand historical context. So we begin in January of 1933. Adolf Hitler comes to power. Please note he was appointed. FDR was sworn in as the President of the United States in March of the same year. In February 1933, just a month later, the German Reichstag, or Parliament building, burns down. A state of emergency is declared in Germany, and with that, the suspension of individual freedoms. Dachau, the first concentration camp, opens a month later. Nazi political prisoners and opponents are incarcerated there. Just a day later, the German parliament passes the Enabling Act. This act essentially gives Hitler dictatorial control over Germany. A week later, Jewish businesses are boycotted. This is an early move which ultimately will help to force Jews out of German economic life. The next week, Jews are removed from government jobs and from certain professions. New restrictive quotas that same month make it difficult for Jews to attend public schools and universities. Jews are forced out of journalism, and there is no longer a free press in Nazi Germany. Those with mental and physical disabilities are now subject to involuntary sterilization. Another enemy of the Reich is now defined. Jehovah's Witnesses, who refuse to swear allegiance to Hitler and the Nazis, are banned in 1935. Homosexual men, also now enemies of the state, are subject to harsher penalties. And in September of 1935, the Nuremberg laws defined who was Jewish. Those defined as Jews, and again, defined racially according to who their grandparents were, They lost their citizenship rights and protections. Roma and Sinti, also known as Gypsies, as well as Afro-Germans, now lost their citizenship as the Nuremberg laws were extended. By the end of 1935, the Nazis had defined and marginalized the racially unfit and their perceived enemies of the state. They had all but removed Jews from Germany's political, social, and economic life. And it was into this historic context, into this world, that the Nazi Olympics was planned.
Sally, thank you so much for that incredible overview of the context around Jim Crow and also Nazi racism, and how both of them were linked to the eugenics theories that were very prevalent starting in the latter part of the 19th century. My name is CHHRE, and I work at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. And we want to give a big thank you to Linda Medvin and the Gutterman Center for hosting us this evening and for asking us to work with them in support of legislation for teachers in Holocaust to fulfill the mandate, not only to teach about the Holocaust, but also to show the intersections between Black history and other histories that focus on other audiences and minorities in the United States. So thank you so much for being here. We've met some of you before, and we also want to give a big thank you to you for all that you're doing in this year that has been incredibly challenging for everyone, whether you're teaching remotely or you're teaching in your classroom or you're doing both. We want to support you, and we've created many resources, some of which Sally shared with you, that are online to support your teaching, whether it's in the classroom or whether it's in the virtual world. So thank you so, so much for what you do. So we're going to look now at the Olympics itself. And Sally gave us an overview of the context of the times and all of the episodes in history that lead up to the 1936 Olympics. And as I mentioned, the museum has incredible resources for you to use to incorporate in your classroom. And we hope that this evening, what we present to you will not be necessarily taught as a one-off in something separate, not as an add-on to all of the numerous things that you already need to teach. We hope that what we share with you today will be part of teaching the continuum of history, to look at how to integrate these resources into what you already do, and to look at the thematic elements that we use in teaching about the Holocaust and that we look at for teaching about the Olympics and all of the events that surround it. So if we go to the PowerPoint, I think, Cody, if you can put that one on, thank you. So if we go to the first slide right here, you will see a famous picture from the Olympics, and you might recognize the person in the middle of the three young men standing at attention, and you will see Jesse Owens there in the middle, which we will get to his story in a bit. But the museum has several resources for you to look at around the Holocaust, of course, the Holocaust, but around the Olympics debate. And if you go to the Google folder, there is a handout that we have made available to you. And it's titled FAU February 2021 Workshop Handout. We're going to refer to that handout with some of the slides so that you can go to some of the links, and you can look at the links and see what the resources are and where you can find them online. So if we go to the next slide, this is where we get into the heart of the debate. And just as an overview, in 1931, Germany was awarded the Olympic Games. And what was unusual about this is that it was not only the Summer Games that Germany was going to host in Berlin, but also the Winter Games. This had never happened before. So if we look at these two documents on this particular slide, you can see that we have several primary sources for you to use. And one of the links that we've provided to you is an online exhibit of an exhibit that we had at the museum that has traveled. It's called Nazi Olympics, Berlin, 1936. If you look at the photo on the left-hand side, the gentleman is looking at a notice to attend a meeting in support of boycotting the Olympics of 1936. And then if you look on the other side at the photo, you will notice the political illustration that shows that the Olympics are being politicized. And that is a debate that continues to happen today. When particular countries are hosting the Olympics, oftentimes issues of human rights abuses will come up in those particular countries. And there have been times when the United States, if you're old enough to remember, when the United States has boycotted the Olympics, such as in 1980. So the movements to boycott the 1936 Olympics surfaced not only in the United States, but also in Great Britain, France, Sweden, Czechoslovakia, and the Netherlands. And the debate over participation in the Olympics was really the most intense in the United States. Traditionally, we sent one of the largest teams, and that is still the case today. But some boycott proponents supported a counter Olympics. And in fact, there was a plan to host a counter Olympics Games in Barcelona in the summer of 1936. But those plans were canceled when the Spanish Civil War began that year in July. Individual Jewish athletes from a number of countries around the world chose to boycott the Berlin Olympics, and many of them also boycotted the trials. And in the United States, some Jewish athletes and Jewish organizations, such as the American Jewish Congress and the Jewish Labor Committee, supported a boycott, as did a number of liberal Catholic politicians and many college presidents. However, once the Amateur Athletic Union of the United States opted in a closed vote to participate in December of 1935, when they voted at the end of 1935, other countries followed the United States' lead and decided that they would also attend the Olympics. So the boycott movement was basically a failure by the end of 1935. So if we go to the next slide, to give you some more background on participation and who was in favor of participating. Avery Brundage, who was the president at the time of the American Olympic Committee, fought to send a team from the US. And this is a quote attributed to him at the top: "The Olympic Games belong to the athletes and not to the politicians." And he wrote in a pamphlet for Fair Play for American Athletes that American athletes should not become involved in the present Jew-Nazi altercation. As the Olympics controversy heated up in 1935, Brundage alleged that the existence of a Jewish communist conspiracy to keep the United States out of the Games was what was behind the boycott movement. And we want to add that those claims were false. There was no such Jewish communist conspiracy behind the debate to boycott the Games. As Sally mentioned before, anti-Semitism was not only prevalent in Germany, and it wasn't only a part of Nazi racist ideology, but we can look at the exhibit that we have online and see examples of anti-Semitic attitudes in the United States as well. And referring back to what Sally shared with us earlier, Our exhibit online, Americans in the Holocaust, will give you more information and more background on the role that anti-Semitism played in many of the debates in the United States with regard to how we responded to the growing Nazi threat in Europe in the 1930s and 1940s. So in December 8th of 1935, the Amateur Athletic Union also defeated the proposal to boycott the Olympics Games by 2.5 votes. So it was a very, very close call. Avery Brundage maneuvered the vote to achieve a victory. And President Roosevelt, who many people reached out to comment on the debate itself, never did give his opinion in public. So we don't know what President Roosevelt thought at this time about this particular debate. But he was given many warnings from high-level American diplomats regarding how the Nazis were exploiting the Olympics for propaganda purposes, which is true in Nazi Germany at the time. And we have a lot of film footage and more information on that in the online exhibit, for which you have the link in the handout. Roosevelt decided that he would stay out of the debate, and that is why he never commented on it. But many major American newspapers did take a stand. The New York Times, for example, took a stand to boycott the Olympics. And many other newspapers also followed, including the Washington Post, the Los Angeles Times, and the Chicago Tribune. Support grew after the announcement in the fall of 1939 of the Nuremberg Laws. In September of 1935, with the issuing of the Nuremberg Laws in Germany, more Americans saw that as a sign that the United States should stay out of the Olympics because of this legalization of anti-Semitism through the Nuremberg Laws themselves. So at that time, you started to see more newspapers in the United States and more people speaking out, saying that we should not attend the Olympic Games of 1936. And this is really critical because if you look at the Nuremberg Laws, they proposed that non-Jewish people who were called Aryans should not be allowed to marry Jewish people. So this was used often as an argument in newspaper articles as a reason for the United States to not take part in the Olympic Games in the coming year. But we also had, as we note in the next slide, those people in the United States who were against participation. And if we look at these two photos, these are two gentlemen who opposed the United States taking part in the Olympic Games. And what we can do here, and you will get this information, it's in the online exhibit, as I mentioned earlier. The two quotes, you have the Brundage quote that we saw earlier, where he says that the United States should stay out of politics when it comes to the Olympic Games. But then you have the gentleman on the left-hand side, Ernst Lee Janke, who at one time was the Secretary of the Navy. He sat on the International Olympic Committee at this time. And if you look at the quote at the top, these are his thoughts about going to the Olympics. Neither Americans nor the representatives of other countries can take part in the games in Nazi Germany without at least acquiescing in the contempt of the Nazis for fair play and their sordid exploitation of the games. So here he's calling out how the Nazis are using, how Nazi Germany, I should say, how Nazi Germany is using the Olympics for propaganda purposes. But behind the propaganda, there's a very different reality. And that takes us back to a lot of what Sally showed us earlier. Because of his stance, Janke was actually removed from the International Olympic Committee. And it was only the first time that that had ever happened. And that had never happened again in the history of the Olympic Committee until 2008, when there were others who were removed over the outcry of China hosting the Olympics. To the right-hand side, you see a man named Jeremiah Mahoney, who also called for the United States to boycott the Olympic Games based on also many of the same reasons that the newspaper articles called out, including the issuing of the Nuremberg laws. When we continue, we can look at the Black voices in the boycott debate. Many American newspaper editors and anti-Nazi groups, led by the president of the Amateur Athletic Union, called for a boycott of the games. Most African-American newspapers opposed boycotting the games. Writers for the Philadelphia Tribune and the Chicago Defender urged that victories by Black athletes would undermine racism and the myth of Aryan supremacy. They hoped that such victories would foster pride at home among Black Americans. And the Chicago Defender reported that American athletes who were Black and track stars such as Ulysses Peacock, Jesse Owens, and Ralph Metcalf favored participating because they felt that by their participation, they could destroy the myth of Nazi Aryan supremacy. So what we're going to do right now, if you look at the handout with the links, and at the top, it says during the workshop, participants will need to go to the following links. What we're going to do right now is give you some time to look at the second link, the Adam Clayton Powell Jr. editorial on the 1936 Olympics. So please click on that link, and I think we might have provided it in the chat box. If you can go to that link and click on it, and we'll give you a few minutes to look at the editorial, to read the editorial, and then we'll come back and address some questions about it. Thank you. And when you get to the web page where the editorial is, you'll see a blue button toward the left that says view this newspaper article. And that's where you can read it. Thank you. Okay, so we are getting closer to the time to take the break. But before we do, hopefully you had a chance to read the article, and the link was in the chat box if you couldn't access it in the Google folder. So just very quickly, we did provide in the handout links to the National Archives questions for analyzing written documents. But we're not going to have time to really go through all of those. That's okay, but they're there for your benefit. What is, and you can put this in the Q&A, you can type in your responses there. What is Adam Clayton Powell's attitude toward Black American athletes participating in the Olympics? And be sure to type in your responses to the question in the Q&A. Thank you. Okay, well, we don't have a lot of time before the break, but let me see. Yes, okay. Okay, I know we were having some trouble accessing it, and at the end of the article, if you did not get to read all of it, he is opposed to their participation. There was a lot of pressure faced by Black athletes to participate or to not participate. On the one hand, they wanted to participate for the reasons that I mentioned earlier, to prove that Nazi Aryan supremacy was a myth. But on the other, and also many of them wanted to participate to show their strength to their fellow Americans and to also hopefully win more opportunities to participate in athletic life in the United States as well. So for Black athletes, this was an opportunity in many ways for them if they did participate, or they hoped at least that it would lead to other opportunities for them, especially as many of them attended segregated universities, particularly in the North, where they did not have access to many of the same training equipment that white athletes had. And also, thank you, Kirsten. Yes, that's true. Adam Clayton Powell's attitude is that African-American athletes should not compete because Nazi racism is also against them, as well as seeing them as being racially inferior. So it was a very tough decision. And one of the things that we do at the museum is we ask our visitors and anybody who's using many of our materials to think about the pressures and motivations of people in making certain decisions. So for Black athletes such as Jesse Owens and Ralph Metcalfe and Ulysses Peacock, they faced pressures to either go to break the myth of Aryan supremacy, or they also face pressure from organizations such as the NAACP, who called on them to boycott the games, not only because they opposed Nazi racial ideology, but because the NAACP and others in the Black community felt that the United States was just using the athletes to win gold medals, to bring back a lot of victory, yet at the same time, they're persecuting them and they're living under segregation and Jim Crow. So there was the element of hypocrisy that many of the newspapers, the general press, did not call out. So while you had articles in newspapers like the New York Times and other newspapers around the United States calling out Germany for its racism and its anti-Semitism, many of those newspapers failed to mention the hypocrisy in the United States of how minorities were being treated at the time. It took the Black press to point out the irony of people calling out Nazi Germany while at the same time either supporting or looking the other way at Jim Crow and segregation. So that's what we hope that you will look at as you integrate some of these resources in the classroom with your students, so that your students can understand the debates centered around the Olympics. And we're going to continue that discussion. We're going to take a break right now, but we will continue the discussion and look at the pressures and motivations on other athletes who were also going to participate in the games of 1936 from the United States. So we'll go on ahead and take a break, and we will come back at 5:05. Thank you. So welcome back, everyone. I hope you had a good break and had time to stretch, maybe get a drink of water. And again, thank you so much for being with us this afternoon. We hope that you're finding this very informative and also very useful with the resources that we are sharing with you. So thank you once again. So continuing with the issue of debates and decision-making. And again, I just want to add that more and more at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, we encourage our audience members, whether it's the public going through one of our exhibits, or whether it's teachers and students in classrooms across the United States or in colleges and universities, we want to put the lens on ordinary people and the choices that they had and the pressures that they faced and what motivated them to make certain choices that they made. So we talked a little bit about Black Americans and Black athletes and the pressures and motivations that they had laying forward with regard to taking part in the Olympics of 1936. And just to recap, some of them felt that they needed to participate to smash this myth of Aryan superiority. Others felt that if they took part in the Olympics and they came back with successes, with medals, that this would provide them more opportunities to move forward in society and to overcome segregation and Jim Crow. Because many of them, even though they attended universities up in the northern part of the country, they were still subjected to some of those examples of Jim Crow that Sally shared. But what about other athletes in the trials who wanted to take part and who had been training for many, many years to take part in the Olympics debate? And if we look at the next slide, we will see that this debate was also one that involved Jewish American athletes. Jewish American athletes, like their counterparts, like Black American athletes, also spent many years training for this moment in time, training to take part, also facing segregation in certain areas of life, such as being allowed to attend certain colleges and universities, facing quotas in attending certain colleges and universities as well. We want to point out, and the online exhibit and the Holocaust Encyclopedia articles that we have on the Olympics show you that anti-Semitism, though different from what we're seeing in Nazi Germany in many ways, anti-Semitism still prevailed in the United States in different aspects of life. And you will see examples of that in the online exhibit that we have. And it's something that we have to consider today because of the increase in anti-Semitic acts and violence. And it's something that we saw just last month in the Capitol here in Washington, DC, when one of the men who went into the Capitol was wearing a Camp Auschwitz shirt. And that has really brought to light, although we are always on top of these issues, to many people, that anti-Semitism did not die with the Holocaust. We saw it in Charlottesville. We've seen it in tragic synagogue shootings, including the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh. And we see anti-Semitic attitudes in the United States in the 1930s and 40s. And as Sally mentioned, with the immigration laws of 1924, the Johnson-Reed Act, Eastern European Jews were largely excluded from being able to come to the United States at that time. And that will play a role later in this history, especially starting in 1938 and 1939. But looking at Jewish American athletes, on the left-hand side, you see two men. One of them, on your left, is a young man named Milton Green, and he is the captain of the Harvard University track team. And he actually took first place in the 110-meter hurdle in the pre-Olympic trials, the regional pre-Olympic trials in 1935. So he made the Olympic team to represent the United States in Berlin in 1936. To his right, you see his teammate, a young man named Norman Connors, who's also Jewish, and he qualified for the final Olympic trials as well. But we're going to listen to the testimony, it's oral, of Milton Green. And again, you can find this testimony on our website, and we provided the links in the Google form, and the link will also be available to you in the handout. So Cody, if you could play the testimony, thank you.
I was always interested in athletics, and I knew that I was a pretty good athlete. I was captain of all the track teams since I was in grammar school. I'd been always thinking and wanting to be in the Olympics. Of course, that was my hope, to be in the Olympics. I had held the world's record in the high hurdles, and also the Harvard-Yale record in the broad jump. And I was watching the performances all over the world. I knew that I'd qualified because I won the preliminary events. There was some publicity in the Boston papers about my roommate and me, Norman Connors. There was a picture of us winning 6 gold medals in the Harvard-Yale track meet. Rabbi Levy was the head of the Temple Israel in Boston, a Reformed temple, and he was well respected all over the United States. And he had seen the publicity and knew that we were potential Olympic candidates, and said he'd like to talk to us. I was confirmed at Temple Israel, and naturally when they asked us to come, asked me and Norman Connors, we agreed to come. I didn't know what they were going to talk about, except that something about the Olympics. They told us about the terrible things that were going on in Germany and the Nazi regime. And it was a shocker to me and Norman. They suggested that it might be a good idea for us not to go to the Olympics because of all these problems, and to sort of register our objections and sort of boycotting the Olympics. And we were quite taken back about that thought. And they tried to explain to us that we would never regret if we did take that action to boycott the Olympics. And that meeting really turned us around, because we were horrified of the terrible things that were going on in Germany. Both Connors and I decided that we would boycott the Olympics. We just felt it was the right thing to do. I spoke to the track coach at Harvard. We told him about our intention. He tried to persuade us not to do it. He said he didn't think it would do much good, and we should try to go to the final tryouts and try to make the team. But we didn't want to do that. After we boycotted the Olympics, no one came to speak to us or ask us if we'd make any statements about it. And I don't think anyone knew particularly that we did boycott it. I think back on making that decision, and whether I would have won a silver or gold or some sort of a medal. And every time I go to the Olympics, I've been to 3 of them, and I particularly watched the high hurdles and the long jump, and I picture myself as maybe having won a medal on it.
Thank you, Cody, for airing that. So that particular testimony did not come to the museum, and we did not know Milton Green's story until we were actually reconfiguring the exhibit to bring it back to the museum in 2008. And it's quite the testimony here that we have from him, because here is a young man who is only 17 years old, who makes a decision at an age when sometimes it's just too hard to comprehend world events and what is happening. Even though he is Jewish, he's also a young teenager. He has other concerns in his life at that time, and he's guided by his rabbi, but at the same time, his coach is encouraging him to go on ahead and compete. And so it says a lot about pressures and motivations and the choices that young people faced at the time in taking part in the games, especially athletes who have been training all of their lives for this, for their young lives. And I think it's very telling when he says at the end that he has attended more games later in his life, and he always wondered, what if things had been different? So we hope that you will look at this testimony. We also have the transcript on the page, and consider how you might use it with students. So when we look at the general public on the next slide and how the general public feels about taking part in the games, this is a poll that we found from March 23rd, 1935. So the AIPO was founded by our Charles Gallup, whose name we now know is synonymous with the Gallup news source. And that was actually what the American Institute of Public Opinion was. It was what is today known as Gallup. This was its name when it was first started by Charles Gallup. So if you look at this question that was posed to Americans, should America refuse to participate in the Olympic Games, which are to be held in Germany in the coming year? Most Americans said no, that we should not refuse to participate. So what is the role of public opinion in swaying choices made by officials, made by politicians? That's a question that, of course, resonates today. When do leaders make choices based on the role of public opinion? So public opinion probably also played a role in determining if we should participate in the Olympics of 1936. So what we're going to look at next is the role of Black athletes at the Olympics. And we're going to look at two stories, but before we do, we're going to listen to some background information on the Olympics themselves, where you're going to hear not only historians talking about the importance of the Olympics, but you're also going to hear the testimonies of two men who took part in the 1936 Olympics. So Cody, thank you. We'll listen now.
800-meter event. Uncle Sam's hope is John Woodruff, overtaking Phil Edwards of Canada, who's running his heart out, trying to match the withering pace of the husky Negro heavyweight who is running him into the ground.
There was very definitely a spatial feeling in winning the gold medal and being a black man. Here I was doing something, and particularly this particular event had not been won by an American in 24 years. So I was very happy for myself as an individual, for my race, and for my country.
To the latter stages of the 19th century, there were a large number of African American athletes who established not just a national reputation, but an international reputation for their athletic performances. Athletes such as Marshall Major Taylor, one of the great bicyclists in American history, Isaac Murphy, the first jockey ever to win 3 Kentucky Derbies, Moses Fleetwood Walker, who was the first African American ever to play Major League Baseball when he signed with the Toledo Mud Hens in the mid-1880s. And what happens around the turn of the century, particularly by the last decade of the 19th century, because of a variety of different factors, including the Jim Crow laws and the black codes, the most famous being the Plessy versus Ferguson decision in 1896, you begin to have segregation. You saw African American athletes being eliminated from predominantly white organized sport around the turn of the century.
This was still an era of segregation. But one of the things that had changed before the 1936 Olympics was the urbanization of African Americans, moving to especially the urban north. They were able to go to high schools where there were sports teams, which wasn't available in the schools in the South, which barely had any facilities. That put them in a position where they could participate in sports, particularly in the individual sports like boxing, the track and field events. You had the legacy of Jack Johnson, the person who did succeed in boxing and became world champion, but didn't conform to the role that was assigned to black Americans. He was attacked, and ultimately his prestige and his money were taken away. That served as a lesson for subsequent generations of black athletes, that you can have power in the society to a certain degree, but you have to be very careful how you exercise it.
The fact of the matter was that blacks were being kept out of baseball, they were being kept out of football, and although I'm not sure how many people really believe this, one of the arguments was that, well, they might be faster, they might be stronger, but they don't play the game smart. All of these, ridiculous lies, but they were widely accepted. In track and field, unlike in team sports, you could measure performance empirically. Jesse Owens is running a 9.9 100 yards. He's just faster than any white man on the planet, and you can't argue against that, and it would be foolish to try to argue it. On May 25th, 1935, in Ann Arbor, Michigan, at the Big Ten track meet, he sets world records in 4 events in the space of less than an hour. This is all with an injury. He'd suffered a back injury horsing around with some of his fraternity brothers the week before. And all of a sudden, he is America's greatest hope for the Berlin Olympics.
Jesse Owens and Ralph Metcalf were definitely heroes in the black community. Even though they might have limitations in terms of training and resources and all of these sorts of things, once they were able to compete, they were able to do it, and they were able to do it well. There was much more ambivalence in the black community over whether to participate or not in the 1936 Olympics. Americans were painting the Nazis as super racists. We had our own experience with racism at home, and it was hard to imagine something worse than Jim Crow in the South. That notion of American democracy versus Nazism was blurred a bit for African Americans. I think that in the end it came down to there was going to be U.S. participation in the Olympics, and there were some talented black athletes who wanted to go. Even if the black press had been totally opposed to going, they wouldn't have been able to influence the decision anyway. The individual athletes made their own decisions, and they wanted to go.
When we went to the Olympics, we weren't interested in politics. We were only interested in going to Germany participating in our events and trying to win as many gold medals as we could win, see, and come home. That was our interest. I made the team when I was 20, and before I got to Berlin, Germany, I had a birthday and I was 21. So we were young. All of us were young. The opening ceremony is when all these Olympic athletes representing all these various nations march in. We came in with our white trousers, blue jackets, and straw hats with a red, white, and blue band. And of course, right after they march in and the games are declared open, they release all these pigeons and they all fly. And that's the opening of the games.
And the games are on. Here in the semi-final heat of the 100-meter dash, Movietone's camera catches the blinding speed of Jesse Owens, cracking the world record in the incredible time of 10 2/10 seconds.
The myth of Nazi Aryan supremacy was smashed to smithereens by the great non-Aryan athletes. Black athletes won the 100, the 200, the 400, the 800, the long jump, the high jump. It certainly proved that this Aryan business of supremacy was ridiculous. These were non-Aryans winning the most important events.
Seeing Jesse Owens, it was almost impossible not to cheer for him, because what you were witnessing was as close to perfection as you or anyone else would ever see. If Jesse Owens had gone to the games of the 11th Olympiad in 1936 in Berlin and had just won his 4 gold medals in those 4 events, the 100 meters, the 200 meters, the 4x100 meter relay, and the broad jump, it would have been one of the most spectacular achievements in the history of sports, and certainly in the history of the Olympic Games. To have done so as an African American in Hitler's capital at a time when the Third Reich was ascendant makes what he did, I think, arguably the most impressive feat in the history of sports. The Nazis weren't stupid. People labor under this misimpression that the African Americans, the 8 of them on the U.S. Olympic track and field team, were winning, that was somehow this incredible insult to the Third Reich. No one was surprised when John Woodruff and Jesse Owens and Ralph Metcalfe and Cornelius Johnson and Dave Albritton and Archie Williams and Jimmy Louval ended up dominating the competition. They had been running times and jumping distances that could have, convinced even a layman of their superiority. That was apparent to everyone.
You're up on a stand, and he's playing the Star Spangled Banner for all the Americans. Then they had young girls that came over, and the girls presented the medal. It kind of does something to you. We came to New York, and they had a big parade for us, but I can't recall, after winning the Olympics, that it opened any particular doors. Now, I'm sure many of the white Olympians were made offers, very fine offers, but I can't recall any of the black Olympians making any great offers. Now, Jesse did pretty well. He got in public relations work, but he never had any real big jobs, He ran against racehorses. You may have heard of him running against racehorse. He did a number of things in order to try to make a living for his family. When they came back to the University of Pittsburgh, they had the University Hall of Fame. They made the Hall of Fame, but I didn't make it, in spite of the gold medal that I'd won and bringing to school international recognition. So that let me know just what the situation was. Things hadn't changed.
Okay, so if we could stop the video there. because we're running out of time.
Even now. But I think the importance of the 1936 Olympics is that.
Thank you. So if we can go back to the PowerPoint, we just have a few minutes left, and then Sally will be working with you again. The John Woodruff portion, especially at the end, that is a point where we can continue to look at what is happening in the United States with Jim Crow when he talks about being denied entry into the Hall of Fame. What impact this has, what impacts the victories have at the Olympics on society here in the United States for Black athletes as they return home. That is a point of entry into looking at the civil rights movement, which Sally will get into in a moment. But the other thing that we want to share with you, and I think you received this in your email from Linda last week, there's an excerpt from Jesse Owens' biography, his autobiography, I should say. And this particular chapter is called Open Letter to a Young Negro. Now, of course, terminology is very important, and we know that today we don't use that word anymore. But he wrote his autobiography in 1965. He passed away in 1980. And this particular excerpt is about his experience at the Olympics. And when you read about it, you also learn that the myth that Hitler walked out on him is not true. Hitler was advised that if he didn't want to receive the victors of the gold medals because he viewed them as being racially inferior, he should just not be in attendance at all. So he was not there when he was awarded the gold medal. He did not walk out in disgust, as is the myth. That was not true. But what is really striking about this particular chapter is how he writes about his friendship with the young man who's in the picture next to him. And that is a long jumper named Lutz Long. Lutz Long was deemed to be one of the prized Olympians for the German team. And it's Lutz Long who works with Jesse Owens when at first in the long jump, Jesse Owens doesn't do very well. Lutz Long pulls him aside and gives him advice. And at one point, Lutz Long, after Jesse Owens is victorious, he does take Jesse Owens by the arm and takes him up to the front to where Hitler is sitting in the audience, and he raises his Jesse Owens arm up in victory. What is also really striking, and we have photos of this in the exhibit, is that Jesse Owens was treated like a rock star when he was in Germany competing in the Olympics. And Germans would swarm him, and we have pictures of him signing autographs. He was cheered on by many Germans in the stands during the games. And that's a huge contrast when you think about what he has to experience back home. So there are two ironies, if you use this story with your students, that you would want to point out. The irony of the fact that he is living under segregation and Jim Crow back in his own country. And also the irony that for a time, these German citizens are reveling in his victory, in spite of the fact that according to Nazi racial ideology, he should be seen as inferior. So there are two ironies there about him in this particular chapter of his autobiography. And what is also really striking is that he and Lutz Long end up being very good friends even after the Olympics. Tragically, Lutz Long goes on to serve in the Wehrmacht, and he's killed in the Second World War in 1944. But Jesse Owens goes on to maintain a friendship with the family, and he goes and visits the family later on. So we're out of time for this particular session, but we hope that you will use these resources, and you have the links in the handout to them. So thank you so much for your attention. We will be answering questions a little later, so make sure you put your questions in the Q&A box. So thank you so much.
Okay, so now we're going to pick up after the Olympics and take a look at the aftermath and see what kind of impact this experience had for African-American athletes and also for the Jewish athletes afterwards. So Cody, if you can pull up the PowerPoint, please. We're on slide 26. Thank you. Okay. So Black Americans in the Nazi Olympics, the aftermath. For Germany, the 1936 Summer Olympics turned out to be a triumph. Its athletes won the most medals of any country, and visitors were full of praise for the quality of the event and the warmth of the German people. In fact, Hitler thought afterwards that after the 1940 Olympics, that perhaps the Olympics from that point forward would always be held in Germany. The New York Times also praised the Nazi Games. They said that the Games put the Germans, quote, back in the fold of nations, unquote, and made them more human again. There was a feeling, a pervasive feeling, that the Games had signaled that Germany was now ready to move forward from 1936 on in peace. It was a particular reporter, however, William CHHRE, whose book Berlin Diary you may have read, who saw through this propaganda and the temporary changes in Nazi Germany. William CHHRE had spent time in Nazi Germany prior to the Games, and he believed that they were just a tool that was being used by the Nazi Reich to hide their true racist agenda. He wrote in his diary on August 16, 1936, I am afraid the Nazis have succeeded with their propaganda. First, the Nazis have run the Games on a lavish scale, never before experienced, and this has appealed to the athletes. And second, the Nazis have put up a very good front for the general visitors, especially the big businessmen. Soon after the closing ceremonies, Hitler resumed his plans for territorial expansion. Jews and the other enemies of the state were persecuted once again. Only 2 days after the Olympics, Captain Wolfgang Fürstner, head of the Olympic Village for the Nazis, committed suicide. He had been dismissed from the German military service because he had Jewish blood in his background. And just 3 years after the Nazi Olympics, Germany invaded Poland and began World War II on September 1st, 1939. For Black Americans, few things changed after the 1936 Olympics. For most of the over 1 million Black soldiers who fought in World War II, fighting for freedom and democracy overseas, it was a hard reality to which they returned. In the United States, they again were the subjects of racism, persecution, and prejudice. The Jim Crow laws continued to limit their civil and human rights. The civil rights movement, however, gained momentum once the war was over. In 1947, the color barrier in baseball was broken with the signing of Jackie Robinson to the Brooklyn Dodgers. In 1948, President Harry Truman integrated the United States Armed Forces. In May 1954, Brown versus Board of Education outlawed segregation in the United States American public schools. But lynching still occurred. In 1955, Emmett Till was murdered in Mississippi for allegedly flirting with a white woman. 2 white men accused of the crime were found not guilty by an all-white jury. Emmett Till's mother, in an act of courage, asked that her son's casket be left open so people could see what had been done to her son. This case, the Emmett Till case, animated the civil rights movement. Rosa Parks helped lead a bus boycott in 1955 in Alabama. And in 1957, Martin Luther King Jr. became the leader of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. By 1963, civil rights demonstrations, protests, and boycotts were being held in most American cities. On July 2nd, 1964, President Lyndon Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act, making segregation in public facilities and discrimination in employment illegal. Discrimination and violence continued, but the Civil Rights Act brought legalized Jim Crow to an end. I now want to present to you, and I'm sure you all see these, but another teaching tool, and that is using obituaries in your classroom, both as a resource, as a primary source for your students, and also an activity where students could actually research an historical figure and then write obituaries. So the first one we're going to look at is the obituary for Marty Glickman, who passed away in 2001. Please note the title of this as I read it to you. This is his obituary, which references the event, the Olympics, from almost 65 years earlier. So the title is Marty Glickman, announcer and blocked Olympian, dies at 83. Marty Glickman, who always believed he was denied a chance to compete in the 1936 Berlin Olympics because of anti-Semitism, but later became the preeminent radio voice in New York sports, died yesterday at Lenox Hill Hospital in Manhattan. He was 83. Again, note that the opening paragraph talks about his Olympic experience. Glickman's broadcasting career began when he was in college in Syracuse, when he was hired to do a sports broadcast on the radio for only $15. That first experience was in 1937. For the next 55 years, Marty Glickman would set the style for generations of sports fans. His trademark call of swish for a basketball shot that went in without touching the rim or backboard was familiar to all of his listeners. After his retirement from broadcasting, Glickman was remembered for what he did not do: run in the 400-meter relay in the 1936 games. And here he's quoted, "If it hadn't been for that decision by our coaches, no one would remember me as an Olympian," he told an interviewer in 1996. "I mean, name another 400-meter relay runner, but I'd much prefer to have run and won a gold medal and not have been remembered." Glickman was born in the Bronx on August 14, 1917. He was the son of a textile salesman and a homemaker and grew up in Brooklyn. In addition to Glickman's wife and daughter, he is survived by 2 sons and another daughter, 10 grandchildren, and 6 great-grandchildren. Now let's listen to this excerpt from a testimony by Marty Glickman. This is also on the museum's website, reflecting on his experiences in the Nazi Olympics and how he viewed it in historical context.
We were aware of the fact that there was anti-Semitism in Germany. We just didn't know what Nazism was. Remember, this is from the perspective of 2 years before Kristallnacht. The Holocaust was not only not a thought, it didn't exist in our imagination, in our dreams. I was on the team. It was a goal I had sought. Holocaust was a word that I didn't even know in 1936. The 400-meter relay was selected beforehand. Sam Stoller would start. I was to run the second leg. Foy Draper run the third leg, and Frank Wyckoff run the anchor leg. The morning of the day we were supposed to run in the trial heats, we were called into a meeting, the 7 sprinters were, along with Dean Cromwell, the assistant head track coach, and Lawson Robertson, the head track coach. And Robertson announced to the 7 of us that he'd heard very strong rumors that the Germans were saving their best sprinters, hiding them to upset the American team in the 400-meter relay. And consequently, Sam and I would be replaced by Jesse Owens and Ralph Metcalf. We were shocked. Sam was completely stunned. He didn't say a word in the meeting. Watching the final, all sorts of emotions flashed through my being. Frustration, certainly. Anger, certainly. I look out on the track and I see Metcalf passing runners down the backstretch. He ran the second leg. And that should be me out there. That should be me. That's me out there. Anti-Semitism was the basic reason, I believe, that Sam and I didn't get to run the Olympic Games. Here were the great black athletes who couldn't be kept off the winning podium. They were marvelous. But here were two rather obscure Jewish American athletes who could be kept from the winning podium so as not to further embarrass Adolf Hitler. But what happened to me was as nothing compared to that which took place later on. There was just no comparison. I was there, and that mattered. What took place was much, much more important afterwards.
Hitler attended the finals of the wrestling competition.
Okay, we can stop here. Thank you. Okay, so from this we learn that for Marty Glickman, this particular experience that he had never went away. He always felt he was the victim. He and Sam Stoller were the victims of anti-Semitism. Now we're going to look at another obituary. This is the one of Jesse Owens. Jesse Owens died relatively young of lung cancer. He was only 66 years old. But this is another great tool. And again, there are quotes in here which talk about how he viewed not only his Olympic experience, but his life after the Olympics. So I'm going to read some of these excerpts to you as well. Again, let's note the headline. Olympic track great Jesse Owens is dead at 66. Again, this was the event that seemed to have defined his life. April 1st, 1980. Jesse Owens, 66, a track star who had won 4 gold medals in the 1936 Olympics in Berlin and one of the greatest athletes of modern times, died of lung cancer yesterday. Each of his Olympic victories produced an Olympic record. All were won in a setting in which Adolf Hitler hoped to demonstrate the soundness of his belief in the superiority of the Aryan race. Later, it was widely reported, and Chris mentioned this before, that Mr. Owens, a Black who was born into a family of sharecroppers in Alabama, had been snubbed by Hitler. But there was no snub, as Hitler had been asked not to congratulate any of the winners. But there was no doubt that Hitler was angered by the young Americans' prowess, and the Nazi press referred to Mr. Owens and the 9 other Blacks on the 382-member US teams as the Black Auxiliaries. Owens once remarked, "I wasn't running against Hitler. I was running against the world." Mr. Owens had to make his stand against radical prejudice in the United States. When I came back, he said, after all of the stories about Hitler and his snub, I came back to my native country and I couldn't ride in the front of the bus, he once said. I had to go to the back door. I couldn't live where I wanted. I wasn't invited to shake hands with Hitler, but I wasn't invited to the White House to shake hands with the president either. James Cleveland Owens was born on September 12, 1913, one of 7 children. The name Jesse came from his experience in elementary school when his teacher asked his name. His nickname at home was his first 2 initials for James Cleveland, JC. And so when he told the teacher JC, she heard Jesse, and he became known as Jesse Owens from that point forward. He began to make a mark as a track phenomenon while he was still in high school, and he won a scholarship to The Ohio State University. There, he helped to support himself with various odd jobs on campus. After 1936, after the Olympics, Mr. Owens began a business career, and at first he prospered. But then there was a period in which he was treated as a kind of curiosity. He ran against a racehorse and ran demonstration races at other athletic events. He also toured with the Harlem Globetrotters, the basketball team. And he later became a personnel official for the Ford Motor Company, and then a sales director for a sporting goods company. It was his name that propelled him into these positions and opportunities. After his death, Mr. Owens' body was to lie in state in the rotunda of the state capitol of Arizona. Governor Bruce Babbitt ordered that flags in the state be flown at half-staff in his honor. Mr. Owens always credited athletics with giving him his start in life, and the United States with giving him a chance to fulfill it. He said, "In what other country in the world could a poor Black kid like me go to all the places I've been, see all the things that I've seen, and make so many friends?" Survivors include his wife of 47 years, the former Ruth Solomon of Tucson, and 3 daughters. So now let's look at this last question. This was one of the 3 essential questions that we started with. Did Olympic achievement of Black American athletes in the Nazi Olympics translate into better lives for those athletes in the United States? And I'm going to leave this to you to draw your own conclusion based on what we've seen and heard and read during this presentation. And I thank you for your attention. And if you have any questions right now, now's the time for you to share them. Thank you.
Thank you, Sally. Continue to put your questions in the chat, in the Q&A. I think we're going to move on and skip our break so we can end a little early, because many of us are involved in the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum event that takes place at 7 p.m. tonight. We have put the invitation information into the chat box and into was on the lead-in. But Cody, are you ready for my PowerPoint? Okay. Many of the requests that we get from the teachers and of all ages and every level is, what do I do? How can I bring it into the classroom? Christina and Sally have highlighted many of the resources, materials, and from the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. But what I'm going to bring you is some additional materials, most of which kick back to the museum anyway, because they have the information, the research, the scholar, the academic pieces. But Cody, next one, please. I've been a teacher for a long time, and I always think that we have to make sure that any of the resources in a subject as emotional and as sensitive as the Holocaust, we need to make sure that we review them in their entirety, to preview them, that publishers are in the business to sell books and may not understand the ages, the reading level, or the emotional maturity of the students. Visual materials, including but not limited to videos, DVDs, YouTube, and everything else that's out there that I don't understand, but young people do, need to be viewed in their entirety prior to using them. This includes something, I don't know how many of you are in classrooms and how many of you are not. In your media center, you just can't go into the media center and pull something off the shelf and decide that you're going to use it without knowing what it actually is. All of you should use the processes and the procedures in your schools to use audiovisual resources or print resources for that matter, to make sure that you have the approval and the support of your administration. And most of all, many times we have students who have seen films or read books or that they've gone to with their families. And because they saw it with their families, it does not mean that these materials are appropriate for you to use in your classrooms. So take into consideration that before you you use a suggested book or use a movie that's in the movies and may not be appropriate for classroom use. Next one, Cody, please. Christina and Sally both refer to the Nazi Olympics. This is a book that is based on the Olympic exhibit. It was in the museum. It was a traveling exhibit. It is now available online. I provided the link for you. And this is a book by Susan Bachrach that's based on the exhibit. Next one. It's never too old. You're never too old to learn the new things. And I did a webinar with the museum and with Docs Teach, as Sally did, and I learned about Docs Teach, which I did not know about. It's teaching with primary sources. You need to have an account, and you can get one at docsteach.org to register for a free account. And this is a lesson that is on there. All of this is provided with, okay, great. It's provided with information. This is the only document on record that we had that was an Olympic related piece. So if you would, this is talking about analyzing a photograph. So it's all written out for you. It's something that a student can do, especially in this remote time where they can observe it and follow along. And then if you click on when you're done, Cody, if that works, it talks about some you can put other information in and other responses and send the response back so that the teacher or whoever is providing the lesson will be able to get the responses from all of the students in the class. So this is a great resource. There's tons and tons, thousands of documents for every aspect of teaching, be it the Holocaust or anything else, where from the National Archives. So it's Facing History and Ourselves. Many of you use and have this book in your schools, Holocaust and Human Behavior. The New Germany on the Olympic Stage is in chapter 7, and it has all of the information, also activities to use in a classroom setting. So these are already ready for you to use and augment the resources that Christina and Sally shared with us. Additional primary sources through PBS Learning, Florida PBS, and ThinkPort, both of which are films and information for you to use in your classrooms. Next, Teaching History, the Olympic Spirit, Teaching with the Olympics. So these are a National History Education Clearinghouse. So these are all vetted sites and appropriate materials that can be used to augment the materials that you get from the museum or use on top of what we have learned today from Sally and Christina. Next, C-SPAN. This is Defying the Master Race, and this is a newsreel about this piece that's on C-SPAN, American History TV. So the experiences of Black and Jewish athletes. Okay, next one. There's a film called Olympic Pride, American Prejudice that is based on a book. And this is the movie that goes with it. And this is about the African-American athletes, both men and women, who participated in the 1936 games and what happened to them before the games, during the games, and when they got home. So it's a story that's really not well known about what happens, and it breaks down to each of the athletes that participated, the 18 African-American Olympians who defied Jim Crow and Adolf Hitler. This is the book that it's based on by Deborah Riley Draper, Olympic Pride, American Prejudice. It goes through, oops, the 1935 Olympics, typo. Okay, goes through that's what the film is based on, this book. Go on. Fast Girls, a novel of the 1936 women's Olympic team. This highlights the female athletes. And, we have in Florida required instruction of the Holocaust. We have required instruction of African American history. We also have required instruction of women's contributions to the United States. And as we move into March, it's Women's History Month. So here's another piece that can be tied into it so that it can be used for to expand your lessons even further and use what we've done tonight into a more expansive piece about women athletes. Christopher Hilton's Olympic Games, 1936 Olympic Games, more detail, more information, just to further, to learn more. Next. Again, Hitler's Olympic Games. I'm sure that a lot of this is repetitive, but it's from different points of view, and they were written at different times, so the research is a little bit varies slightly. Next. The Nazi Games of 1936. This is a big like coffee table sized book, but it talks about the training regimens and the athletes and the contest. So it's more information. Something like a topic like the Olympic Games is not just an academic piece. I mean, when we talk about integrating the Holocaust into multiple disciplines and cross-curricularly, why not have this kind of information available in a PE class or a health class or in some of the other classes that that we can integrate Holocaust education into, an African American education. Next. Jeremy Schaap was somebody that you saw on the film of that Christina showed, and this is the untold story of Jesse Owens and Hitler's Olympics. And he was the one who was interviewed, and so he's really an expert in the field, and this is his book. American Experience, PBS, talks about the 1936 Olympics. These are all clips and things that you can use to support the materials. Sometimes now with the remote learning, we need to give our students something that's a little more visual, in addition to, and this augments and adds to what we have talked about from the museum. And I think that is the last one. At this point, we are going to move to the questions, the Q&A. Ladies, are we up?
Sure. So there's a question about the data and who participated in the poll. We have that data. I don't have it right offhand, but what I will do is ask our historian to give it to me, and I'll email it to Linda. And Linda, if you can send it to Che, that would be great. Okay. There's a question at the top. There are some great resources available on linking and thinking about how QAnon is rehashing and repackaging anti-Semitism. Is there a collection of these somewhere or a particular resource you would recommend? Well, I can tell you what we have at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. We ground everything, of course, in the context of the history. If you go to our website right now, which is ushmm.org, at the very top of our landing page right now, in light of what we saw on January 6th at the Capitol, we include some resources that you can use with your students that explain Nazi symbols. Thank you so much for pulling that up. That is, we feel very strongly, of course, that you ground everything in the context. And so this is a resource for students to see where a lot of this thinking first started. What we've also done and what we have, if you go on Facebook to our Facebook page, and you don't have to have a Facebook account, almost every Wednesday, every other Wednesday, we host a Facebook Live interview with experts on a particular topic. And we hosted about 3 weeks ago a Facebook Live episode on why people are in extremist movements. I would strongly encourage you to watch that Facebook Live. You can just Google Facebook Live, Holocaust Museum Communities of Hate. And if you Google that, you will receive the link. It'll take you right to the link where we have that particular interview. And it's an interview with a man, an academic, and his name escapes me off the top of my head, where he speaks about why people joined the Nazi movement, why they became Nazis, and the differences today. Back then, they were doing it for the glory. Today, it comes out of people who feel that they've been marginalized and they want to feel like they belong to something bigger. And it's also due to the lack of media. There it is, Communities of Hate. I can see it right there. So it's very important to watch that because it gives you the reasoning behind, it gives you the perspective from the academic field. But the man who's speaking about this, he is actually also a Holocaust survivor as well as an academic in the field of extremism. So we encourage you to watch that. We also have lesson plans looking at propaganda through the lens of media literacy. And these are very strong questions that ask not just to analyze propaganda, but to consider the consequences of a particular piece of propaganda, of a news source, to think about who's writing it, what are the biases of that particular news source or organization, and what are the long-term, what are the consequences? What are the potential consequences? So we also have some interviews with a wonderful scholar named Susan Benish, where she looks at dangerous speech. She doesn't use the term hate speech, but she uses the term dangerous speech. And what we can do is, we don't have them all grouped in one place, but we can send them to Linda and she can send it to everybody on what we have. So I hope that's helpful to you. But Facebook Live, we will be doing a Facebook Live coming up soon on conspiracy theories. So please follow us on social media. And I think there's one more question.
There's a couple more.
Alejandro, a friend of mine, thank you so much for that comment. I hope you're doing well. And thank you so much for joining. Those of you who are joining from other parts of the world, this is really wonderful. So were all American Olympians given the choice to participate or not? Yeah, they were. And you can find more information about that in our book that Susan Bachrach wrote, that Linda shared. We have a lot more information. So I think I got to everybody's questions.
Doug McKetchen's question, did you comment? I think that you answered this in the course of what you said, how the Nazis dealt with the success of the Black athletes. And did the Nazis argue that it was white blood and Black athletes that won?
For the most part, yeah, and Sally did touch on that. For the most part, they made certain excuses, not so much about blood, but it was downplayed after a while.
Well, and they won more medals than any other country anyway, so they also emphasize that.
But it's a contrast between how some of the German media really hyped some of the athletes at first, like Jesse Owens, and like I mentioned before, you know, he was loved. I mean, they just ate him up. They ate up what he was doing. But then you see a switch, and that, you know, this is also a good lesson in media studies and how the media can really give a certain perception to its audience and then switch. But we, on that note, we have a wonderful citizen history project, History Unfolded, where we are creating a database of newspaper articles from around the United States, thanks to participants, teachers, students, and others who are submitting articles from their local papers and about what their papers were reporting on different topics related to the Holocaust from that time period, from the 1930s and 1940s. And we just launched a new lesson plan on the Black American press and reporting on the Holocaust. And Linda, that's in the handouts that we've given you, and we'll make those available. The link to that lesson plan is in there. So you have these newspaper articles, great primary source documents to use from the Black American press on what they're reporting about what's happening in the Third Reich. So please stay tuned. Please stay with us, follow us on social media. Please continue to stay engaged with the Gutterman Center and everything that they're offering, because they have wonderful resources, and we hope to continue working together. Thank you.
It's my pleasure to work with the two of you, and we've done a few of these, and we're getting it into down pat, but we're happy to present little pieces of the Holocaust jigsaw that are not the same old, same old. So that's an exciting piece. I thank you, Sally and Christina, for your outstanding presentations. And I know that you have a few things, both of you have, we all do have a few balls in the air. So I appreciate your dedication and your time. It's something to think about. You've given a lot of resources, a lot of food for thought for our teachers and for the members of our community who are here to learn more about the Holocaust, and this is a piece of it. For all of you that have attended, thank you so much for taking the time out of your day and spending the time with us. Especially for the educators in the classroom, we really appreciate what you're doing under these very trying times, wherever you may be. All of the materials will be posted on our website, probably by the beginning of the week, including a recording of the session. Sally, you need to send me your PowerPoint, but they will be posted and they will be available. And I will also add a couple of other things. I'll add the link for History Unfolded and the answer to your question, whatever you send, Christina. We will send you a brief survey by email. Please fill it out for us. It helps us. We are totally self-funded, and so when we are writing grants, it's always good to have data to present, and also it helps us in planning for our next programs, because we're going to start working on next year's programs pretty soon, because we know that gives us an idea of what you're looking for and what you want. Again, all of today's participants are invited to join the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum Southeast Region in their event that starts at 7 p.m. The link was in the if you would put it put it out there, it was in the original lead-in, and as well as in the chat again. And it's normally it would be a big dinner that we've had. Obviously, in the time of COVID, we're not having big dinners, but this is an event, and we work so closely with the museum that it's our pleasure to extend the invitation of Robert Tannen, who's the regional director of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. For everyone else, have a great evening. Thank you for coming. Stay well, stay safe. No, I don't have to say drive carefully. I think everybody's okay with that. And good night.